My wife sent our son off to kindergarten, and I noticed she had forgotten the keys. Just got downstairs, I saw her walking arm in arm with her first love, laughing sweetly. Tomas, our son, was beside them calling out, "Dad," as though they were the happiest family of three. It wasn't until they noticed me standing behind them that my wife hurriedly pulled away. He's very ill, with little time left. His only wish is to be with his wife and children. I'm just helping him out, she explained, a nervous edge in her voice. I nodded and turned to take my son to do a paternity test. Tomas struggled, shaking his head. "You're not my dad. Luca's my dad." "You're the bad guy," he yelled, tears welling in his eyes. Luca stepped in to stop me, trying to reason with me. "George, don't be upset. He's just a kid. We're just playing a part in all of this." He continued, "Don't let it affect your marriage. If you really can't handle it, I'll make sure Becky and I never see each other again." I forced a thin smile, not bothering to reply. Before I could speak, Becky Miller stepped in front of me, pulling Luca behind her. She glared at me. "I'm just doing a favor. George. Don't you have any compassion? You're always so angry." I looked at her with a faint, cold smile and handed Tomas over to Luca. "Well then, I wish you and your little family all the best. May you never be apart." Becky Miller's face turned pale with fury as she dragged me into a corner. "George, what's your problem?" she demanded, eyes sharp with frustration. I gave a bitter laugh but stayed silent. Today was supposed to be our 5th wedding anniversary. I had planned a candlelit dinner and movie tickets, hoping to spend a quiet night with her. But she said she had already planned to go to the spa after dropping Thomas off at kindergarten. I said I was going to send Tomas off, but she refused again, saying she was afraid I would be late for work. Turns out, she was meeting Luca, her first love. When I wanted to surprise her on our anniversary, she brought Tomas to call Luca daddy. The look on Becky's face told me everything. She seemed annoyed, as though I was intruding on their happy family moment. It hurt to think that Tomas, the boy I had loved and raised as my own, might not even be my biological son. A sharp ache hit my chest, and I blinked back tears, the sting of it overwhelming. But Becky thought I was angry at her. "I told you, it's just because Luca's dying and I'm fulfilling his last wish. Please, don't overthink this." I shook my head. "Since you're so full of compassion, maybe I should make it easier for you. Why don't you go ahead and divorce me, then marry Luca? That way, you can take care of him while he's sick. You'll have everything you want." When she heard my words, Becky stood frozen, speechless. "You're actually saying this to me?" She scoffed. "Do you forget that it's because of me that you have what you do now?" Just then, Luca walked over, holding Tomas in his arms. "Becky, why don't you go back to George? I'll go to the hospital by myself. I've always been alone, after all." He coughed a few times, looking drained as he gazed at Becky. Becky rushed over to support him. "You're not alone. You still have me." Tomas, with his little arms, hugged Luca. "Daddy, you still have me and Mommy." I turned on my heel and walked away. Becky seemed like she was about to chase me. But Luca spoke again. "Go after George. Let me go to the hospital alone." She didn't follow me. It hit me like a ton of bricks. No matter what, she would never choose me. After leaving Becky's house, I went straight to my dad's place. My mother passed away when I was young, and it was my dad who worked tirelessly to raise me. He even suffered a disability from working on construction sites years ago. Because Becky couldn't stand the fact that my dad was from the countryside, she never wanted to live with him. So, after we got married, I bought my dad a house in the neighborhood next door. This way, I could take care of him, and whenever he wanted to see his grandson, Tomas, he could. At one point, Becky even threatened to divorce me over the house. In the end, my dad was the one who proposed putting the house in both mine and Becky's name to settle things. As soon as I opened the door, I saw my father washing discarded vegetable leaves he had picked up from the market. A pang of sadness struck my heart as I rushed forward and grabbed his hand. "Didn't I tell Becky to send you living expenses every month? Why are you still picking up discarded vegetable leaves?" As I spoke, I noticed the neatly arranged cardboard boxes in the living room, things my dad had picked up to sell. Had Becky really never sent him any money, despite me handing over all my salary every month? My dad didn't expect me to come back so suddenly. He looked up with surprise and said, "Son, what are you doing here? Where's Becky? Where's Tomas?" I sighed, looking at his graying hair. A wave of grief washed over me. It seemed like my dad understood what I was feeling. He patted my back and said, "George. As long as you're doing well, it doesn't matter to me. It's nothing." For years, I had been so busy with work and taking care of my small family that I had neglected the man who raised me. Once I divorce Becky, I'll definitely bring my dad to live with me and take care of him properly. I smiled, trying to mask my emotions. These aren't nutritious. Let's go out and eat instead. My dad immediately shook his head. Don't waste money eating out. Wait here, I'll make something for you. He walked toward the fridge, but when he opened it, all that was inside was a bottle of milk that was close to expiring. There was nothing else. He turned around and said, "I'll go buy some vegetables. Remember when you were little? You always loved the meals I cooked." I nodded and went to the supermarket to buy some fruit and supplements. When I returned home, I found the front door had been broken into. Thinking a thief had entered, I rushed inside to check. But instead of a burglar, I found Becky standing in the living room, directing a few people to throw out the cardboard boxes my dad had gathered. She turned and saw me. Her expression smug as she said, "What are you doing here? This place is closer to the hospital. Luca's moving in to live here for his treatment. We'll need to move your dad out for a few days." Her words struck a nerve, and I couldn't hold back my anger. "Becky, who do you think you are, telling Luca to move in here? Why should my dad have to leave?" Becky, clearly caught off guard by my tone, since I had always obeyed her, looked at me in surprise. "George, can you not be so stingy? Luca's mother is coming to take care of him too, where else can she live if not here?" I snorted. "This is my house. Where Luca stays doesn't concern me." Becky rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. "Luca's staying here, and I've already agreed to it. You can take your dad and go live somewhere else." She said it as though it was her house and her decision alone. Luca, standing beside her, chimed in. "George, I'm just staying here for a few days. Why don't you take your dad to a hotel? I'll cover the cost, all right?" I glanced at Luca's smug expression. There was no trace of a sick man in him. Just as I was about to refuse, Becky coldly interjected. "Why should your dad stay in a hotel at your expense? Your money didn't just fall from the sky, did it? It's wasteful for him to live alone in a whole house." She pointed to the property deed. "And don't forget, my name's on the deed. I'm the owner. You're living here at my mercy, so don't even think about opposing me." She continued with a smug, condescending tone. "And don't you forget, George. If it weren't for my family's support, you wouldn't even have been able to go to college. You wouldn't have this nice house. You should be grateful. But instead, you defy me." As she spoke, my anger flared, but I was helpless. I was just a poor student when I became her boyfriend. It was thanks to the Miller family's financial support that I could finish college in this city, and Becky certainly played a major role in my success. But every time we argued, she would throw that fact in my face, constantly reminding me that she was my savior. But none of that gave her the right to cheat on me. Before I could say anything, a commotion came from the door. Mrs. Hand, Luca's mother, moved in with a large bundle of belongings. Several relatives followed her inside. "Wow, my son really knows how to choose. Look at this place, the location is fantastic, the transportation is convenient, and there's so much greenery. It's way better than the house back home. There's another house in the neighborhood next door. You all should move in too, there's plenty of room. Take this opportunity to tour around and enjoy yourselves." She turned around and noticed my dad standing at the door, giving him a disgusted look as she sharply asked, "Who are you? What are you doing standing in front of my door?" She frowned at the pile of cardboard on the floor and clicked her tongue. "Such a high-end neighborhood, and the management lets people like you in to collect trash? People like you carry viruses. Get out, get out." One of the relatives nudged Mrs. Hand and said, "Hey, he doesn't look like someone who collects junk. Maybe he's the caregiver your son hired." "Oh? You're my son's caregiver? Then why are you just standing there? Go clean up and get us some water. Don't you have any common sense?" As she scanned the vegetables my dad had bought, she added with disdain, "Hurry up and cook. Or I'll fire you." My dad, still confused, looked at me for guidance. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Hand shoved him. "Are you deaf, or just too dumb to understand? Look at you, you're disabled. You look like a beggar. I'm letting you be a caregiver out of pity. Go cook, now. With that push, my dad lost his balance and fell to the ground. Dad! I rushed forward to help him up. I looked around at Mrs. Hand and her relatives, fury rising in me as I shouted, "This is my house. Get out now, or I'll call the police." Mrs. Hand stared at me, clearly taken aback. But then, she laughed and placed her hands on her hips. "You're crazy. A junk collector can afford a place like this? And you're telling me to leave? This is my son and daughter-in-law's house. If anyone's calling the cops, it'll be me." I glared at her, taking out my phone to dial the police. But Becky stepped forward and, to my shock, snatched the phone from my hand. "What are you doing here, you junk collector? I let your dad come here as a caregiver because I felt sorry for him. Now, pack up and leave, immediately." Then she leaned down and whispered to me. "Think about your mistakes. This is the price you pay for going against me. Without me, you'd just be a trash collector." Mrs. Hand smirked and leaned against the doorframe, saying, "You better not take anything with you. Look at you two, pathetic and poor. You probably don't have anything worth taking. Don't even think about stealing from the owners of this house." My dad couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and shouted, "This house was bought for me by my son. If anyone's leaving, it's you." Mrs. Hand was instantly furious. "What? Are you trying to extort me? Let me teach you a lesson today." With that, she raised her hand and slapped my dad across the face. Her slap was full of force, and my dad's face immediately swelled up. I reached out to support him, but Luca stepped forward and blocked me. "Why are you still here? Becky told you to leave, haven't you learned your lesson yet?" Mrs. Hand's anger grew even more intense. She kicked my dad. "Hurry up and leave. Don't make me drag you out." My dad, already weak and frail, was pushed so hard by Mrs. Hand that he collided with the doorframe and immediately lost consciousness. Seeing what had happened, my face turned pale instantly. Becky was equally shocked. She hadn't expected Mrs. Hand to actually hit someone. "Dad! Wake up! Don't scare me. I didn't even care about anyone else." I grabbed the phone from Becky's hand and immediately called for an ambulance. Ms. Hand spat sarcastically. "This is my house. Don't cause a scene here. You're just embarrassing yourself." Her relatives, who had come with her, chimed in as well. "Are they here to extort money or what? This is so unlucky, get them out of here." One of them even rolled up his sleeves, ready to throw my dad out. I shoved his hand away in fury and snapped, "You touch my dad, and I'll make you regret it." Maybe it was my intense anger that made them freeze, but no one moved. At that moment, Luca, who had been standing by watching, slowly said, "Mom, what are you doing? You can't just hit people. Becky, why don't you take Mom and let her rest for a bit?" Then, with a glance at me, he added, "As for the junk collector, his son is standing right there. He should be fine." Luca was clearly trying to provoke me, but my mind was on my dad. I was only praying the ambulance would arrive soon, and I couldn't be bothered with Luca's taunts. I looked at Becky, my voice cold. "Becky, do you still have a conscience? My dad is my bottom line. You'll regret this. My dad treated you so well, always putting you first. I've been giving you my entire salary every month. But you? You've even withheld his living expenses. And now he's lying here, his life hanging in the balance, and you're still going to care for the person who hurt him?" Becky's eyes flickered with hesitation. She bit her lip and started to speak. Before she could finish, Ms. Hand exploded. "Who are you calling a murderer? You're the one twisting the truth. You're the ones who refuse to leave my house and are pretending to be unconscious to extort money. How dare you accuse anyone? Becky, get these shameless people out of here." Becky stood frozen, not daring to move. She was afraid of making things worse. Ms. Hand glared at Becky, then dramatically sat down and began to moan, clutching her forehead. "Mom, are you okay?" Becky rushed to her side, helping her up. Her hesitation vanished as she quickly snapped at me, "George, take your dad and get out. Don't just stand here and make a scene." At that moment, every last ounce of affection I had for Becky disappeared, replaced by nothing but disappointment and hatred for Luca. Thankfully, the ambulance arrived just in time. The doctors worked quickly to stabilize my dad, saving his life. Watching him lying unconscious in the hospital bed, his life still uncertain, I felt an overwhelming pain in my heart. In the 5 years Becky and I had been married, I felt I owed her nothing. She had never worked since we got married, and I was the one doing all the household chores after work. The woman I had loved and cared for all these years not only cheated on me but had nearly killed my father. I really wanted to ask her if she had any conscience left. But now, there was no point in asking. After leaving the hospital room, I called the police. Then I dialed Becky's number. When the call connected, Luca's lazy voice came through. "George, Becky's taking a bath right now. What do you need?" "Well, the soundproofing in this house is amazing. And the living conditions are great. Mom and I are really happy here. You'll need to stay in a hotel for a while, okay?" I furrowed my brow, imagining the smug look on his face when he said those words. I hung up the phone immediately. I texted Becky, "I've called the police." Less than a second later, Becky called me back. As soon as I answered, I heard her frustrated voice. "Why did you call the police? Am I committing a crime just by living in my own house?" When I didn't answer, she softened her tone. "It's just that I didn't spend our anniversary with you. I'll make it up to you tomorrow, okay? George, you need to learn to be grateful. Without me, you wouldn't have your son or your house." Before she could say more, I cut her off. "I've already done the paternity test with Tomas. It's up to you whether to divorce by agreement or by prosecution. And I've called the police. This won't just be swept under the rug. I've already retrieved the security footage from the house, and we'll see each other in court." Becky shouted, "I don't." I ended the call and turned off my phone. The next day, Becky came to the hospital with Luca and Tomas. I blocked their way at the door to the ward. "What are you doing here?" Becky, holding Tomas, looked at me and said, "George, what did you mean by your call earlier? Tomas is your son." I scoffed. "Becky, the paternity test results are in. Want to see them?" Becky's face turned pale, and she glanced at Luca before speaking. I did the math. During that time, I was only with you and Luca, and I was closer to my ovulation period when I was with you. Tomas should be your son. Even if Tomas isn't your son, he's called you Dad for so many years. George, you can't be heartless. Without the financial support from my family back then, how would you have what you have now?" I snorted. "The money your Miller family gave me? I've paid it all back, with interest. As for why you married me in the first place, you know exactly why. Becky hadn't planned to keep the baby when she got pregnant. But the doctor told her that because of damage to her reproductive system, this was her only chance to be a mother. That's why she married me and had Tomas." Luca gently patted Becky's shoulder before turning to me. "Sorry. George. A few weeks before you and Becky got married, she came to me, but I was already dealing with some problems with my girlfriend at the time. We didn't have much choice. Now that things have gotten this far, it seems pointless to keep dragging it on." I took a deep breath and remained silent. He smiled and then continued, still with that smug expression on his face, "I feel bad that things got so out of hand, but well, here's the deal," Luca said, "name your price. And I'll pay you. I know you're doing this on purpose because you care about Becky and want her back. But your actions will only make her hate you more." Becky sneered when she heard this. "That's right. You're only making me more annoyed with you. After all these years together, how could you possibly be willing to divorce me? Don't even bring up Tomas, he'll still call you Dad. You keep talking about going to court, but you're just hoping I'll come back to you. Get your dad discharged from the hospital quickly. Are you trying to scam money by staying here? Stop making yourself look so pathetic." I glared coldly at both of them. They were the ones who had put my father into a coma, and instead of taking responsibility, they were twisting the truth. I wasn't going to tolerate this anymore. "Becky, what you think doesn't matter to me anymore. As for compensation, my lawyer will be in touch with you." Becky glared at me, her eyes full of anger. "George, what are you talking about? How could you treat me like this?" Luca pulled Becky to his side and, with an annoyed expression, spoke to me. "George. This has nothing to do with Becky. She's just too kind and was helping me fulfill a wish. As for your father, I'm sorry, and I'll take full responsibility. Whatever compensation you want, I'll pay it. Just don't make things harder for Becky." He sighed dramatically, placing a hand over his chest and coughing twice. Becky, with a look of heartache, grabbed Luca's hand and softly said, "Luca, you didn't do anything wrong. You don't need to apologize. I won't let you take responsibility for this." Then, turning her gaze to me, she sneered, "George. Stop causing trouble. You really think Luca should pay you? Don't pretend you don't know your dad is just faking his illness. I shouldn't have come here today. It's sickening. She grabbed Luca's hand, furiously turning to leave. Luca pretended to block her, but the smug look in his eyes was unmistakable. I have seen Luca's face like this countless times, and Becky has taken his hand and walked away from me countless times. From my initial anger to the later exhaustion, and now, the indifference, no one knew the emotional turmoil I had gone through. If I had let go sooner, maybe my dad wouldn't still be lying in a coma in the hospital. Luca, still feigning concern, added, "George, don't make Becky angry anymore." Becky turned to Luca and sighed, "I should have just stayed home and had dinner with Mom. I'll let the police decide if my dad's really faking it or not." Becky rolled her eyes, and Luca gave me a mocking look. Since our marriage, Becky had rarely called my dad, Dad, and when she was upset, she would even address him by his full name. Sometimes, it took several reminders to get her to come back and have dinner with him. A woman like this. I had only now come to truly see for who she was. Becky tried to say something else, but I was done listening. I turned to Luca and said, "As for you, Luca, instead of trying to stir things up here, why don't you go home and check on your mom? Maybe you'll still have time to send her off." Luca's mocking expression instantly vanished. He frowned and asked, "George, what did you do? Didn't I apologize to you already? You didn't really call the police, did you? Is this really necessary?" He quickly pulled out his phone and dialed his mom's number. Luca's face grew darker with each passing moment as he hung up the phone, grabbing Becky's hand. "Becky! He had the police arrest my mom. George, how could you do this?" Luca shouted. "I didn't expect you to be this vengeful. My mom's so old, how could you do something like this?" Becky's expression also changed as she turned to me, scolding, "George, you're calling the police over something so trivial? How can you waste police resources like this? Luca's mom's health isn't great. Do you think you can take responsibility if something happens to her? Get the police to release Luca's mom, and I'll forgive you. Otherwise, I really will get angry. Can't you show a little class? This is such a small matter, and you're calling the cops?" I was furious. "Becky, you think this is a small matter? My dad's still in a coma. I don't care if his mom is healthy or not. What I do know is that you two broke into my house and insulted us. This isn't something that can be brushed aside easily." Becky, irritated, glanced at Luca before her expression showed a hint of panic. She approached me and tried to put her arm around mine, but I coldly brushed her off. "George, I know Luca and the others went too far this time. But didn't he apologize to you? And we're still friends, there's really no need to make this so difficult. Do me a favor and let the police release her. If you do, I won't hold anything against you. Even though you've paid back my family's money, don't forget that without it, you wouldn't have the life you have now. You don't need to worry. I'll go back and live with you like we agreed. You just want me to come back, right? I'm willing to do it." Looking at Becky, whose face exuded an air of entitlement, I was completely stunned. I couldn't believe how out of touch she was. I chuckled dryly. "Becky, you really think you have that much power? I'll have my lawyer send you the divorce papers. If you refuse to sign, I'll file for a lawsuit. And about Tomas, I've already done a paternity test, so think carefully about your next move." Luca, seeing that I was unwilling to back down, grew agitated. "George, you can't be this petty, can you? Fine, I'll just take my mom and leave your house right now. As long as you don't press charges, I'll stop seeing Becky. I just want you to treat her right and not make her angry anymore." At this point, Luca was still trying to stir things up. Every time he said he'd stop seeing Becky, she would always jump in to defend him, fulfilling all his demands without question. This time was no different. As expected, Becky patted Luca's hand comfortingly and then snapped at me, "George, you'll regret this. It's just a few days of staying here to see a doctor, and you're making such a big deal out of it. You don't even have that kind of vision. What kind of man are you? I was wrong about you. Luca and I have always just been friends. It's your constant suspicions and anger that pushed me toward him in the first place. I'll give you one last chance, release Luca's mom, or I'll divorce you. When that happens, even if you beg me on your knees, I won't forgive you." I snorted in disdain. "Don't worry, that day will never come." With that, I turned to leave. But Becky rushed forward, grabbing my arm. "Who told you to leave? You haven't agreed to release Luca's mom yet. I won't let you go. Luca quickly stepped in front of me, grabbing my arm. George, enough already. Becky's agreed to you, just call the police and have them release her. I shook off both their hands and, without a word, called for security from the nearby nurses' station. This is a hospital room, not a place for you two to cause a scene. I coldly watched as security escorted them out. Then, I quickly handled my dad's transfer paperwork. I didn't want anything to do with either of them anymore. Just as I had finished readmitting my dad to the hospital, Becky and Luca's calls started flooding in. I rejected every one of them. Then came a barrage of messages, all demanding that I withdraw the police report or intervene to get the police to release Luca's mom. Their tone was aggressive, filled with insults aimed at both me and my dad. Becky even sent me a message saying she would never sign the divorce agreement unless I didn't want a penny. This, I realized, was the result of years of pampering her without reservation. After we got married, I had always been accommodating, especially with my frequent business trips keeping me away. I felt guilty for not being there, so I indulged her even more. But in return, she had looked down on me, even enabling Luca's family to harm my father. I had once told her that my father was my final bottom line. This time, I would not back down. I was determined to make them pay for everything. I blocked all their incoming calls. Then tasked my lawyer with handling the divorce case and the home invasion and assault lawsuit against the Hand family. While I was at the hospital taking care of my dad, I unexpectedly found out that one of the doctors was a former college classmate. George, I can't believe it's really you. I looked up at the woman in the white coat in surprise. You're Janet? Yes, I didn't think you'd remember me. We even participated in the university debate competition together. I nodded and complimented her. I'm impressed you became a doctor after graduation. That's incredible. Upon hearing my genuine praise, Janet lowered her head and smiled. I didn't expect you to have gotten married right after graduation. I heard you're now the manager of a big company, pretty impressive. After that debate competition, I made a point to check on you. Back then, you were quite the campus figure, and you and your girlfriend seemed so in love. Her tone carried a hint of regret. I paused, then responded, I'm in the middle of a divorce. Divorce? Janet was clearly surprised. I felt like I had found someone to talk to and began telling her everything about my marriage with Becky and Luca, leaving nothing out. Janet listened patiently and then, in a tone full of disbelief, said, how could there be such a woman? She really doesn't know how to appreciate what she has. George, don't worry. Your father's condition is under control. He'll wake up soon. I'll prepare a medical report to help with your case. I nodded gratefully, knowing that my father was stable and would soon recover. The heavy weight on my chest finally lifted. I glanced back at my dad's bed and silently vowed to make up for everything he had been through in the years ahead. But I didn't notice that Janet was looking at me with a faint, approving glint in her eyes. With the medical report from the hospital, the police quickly moved forward with the case, and the prosecution was soon initiated. Meanwhile, my lawyer delivered the divorce agreement to Becky. On the very same day the agreement was sent, Becky called from a new number. She was furious, her voice rising in a screech. George! How dare you block me? I'm seriously pissed off. And what's with this divorce agreement? Are you trying to scare me? Do you think I'm afraid? You can't leave me. If you do, you're nothing but an ungrateful, heartless bastard. I responded, my tone growing darker. Becky, no matter what you say, we can't go back. I'm not trying to scare anyone, I just want to get justice for my dad. I took a deep breath. I've already told you, I'm divorcing you. Without me in the way, you and Luca can finally be a family. There was a sharp scream from the other side of the line. I can't divorce you. Her voice dropped, trembling as she continued, George, can we stop fighting? Where are you? I'll come to you right now, and we'll make up for our anniversary, okay? Don't you remember? You had a candlelit dinner and movie tickets all planned, and the roses are still in the car. I know everything. You love me so much, how could you really leave me? No matter how much I hurt you, you can't leave me, George. Stop pretending. Hearing her words, I finally understood that she knew everything. She had been recklessly hurting me and my family all this time, relying on my love for her. Every anniversary, I had gone out of my way to arrange something special. But no matter what I planned, I always ended up alone because Luca always found some excuse to take her away. When I called to confront her, she would always dismiss it with, "Let's do it another time. Luca has something to do today." I chuckled darkly. "Becky, just sign the papers. The anniversary is over, and I no longer love you. I just want a divorce, nothing more." With that, I hung up and blocked the number immediately. The next day, my lawyer informed me that Becky was willing to sign, but before doing so, she wanted to meet me in person. I agreed. At the law office, I saw Becky, looking worn out and exhausted, with Luca still by her side. Becky, with tears in her eyes, said, "How could you not care for me all these days? I'm not mad anymore, can we just stop this, please?" I stared at her, confused. "I came here because you agreed to sign the divorce papers." Becky gazed at me, eyes filled with tears. "How can you be so heartless? Don't you love me anymore? Don't you want Tomas?" I scoffed. "Becky, I think I've made myself clear. Tomas isn't my son. And I don't love you anymore." Seeing the seriousness in my eyes, Becky's body seemed to crumble. Luca stepped forward, his tone pleading. "George, my mom has realized her mistake. Can you drop the lawsuit? All the blame is mine, I'm the one who's at fault. You're a son yourself, how can you let your parents, at age, suffer like this?" He went on, "If you drop the lawsuit, we'll do anything you want." As I glanced at my phone, I saw a message from Janet. My dad had woken up, was in stable condition, and had just been taken off the 4-drip. He could start eating again. I sneered, then turned to Luca and Becky. "I'll drop the lawsuit, but only if she agrees to leave with nothing. If she's willing to walk away with nothing, I'll consider it." As soon as I finished speaking, Becky's face was filled with shock. After all these years, I had pampered her, never letting her do housework, even brainwashed by her so-called kindness, and had been compliant to her every whim, working tirelessly for her. The luxurious life she enjoyed, the lifestyle of a lady, was the result of my hard work. I had even taken on business trips for the company, traveling out of town just to earn more commissions to provide her with a better life. But how could she understand that all my indulgence and love were based on the premise that I loved her? When I loved her, I was willing to give everything willingly. When I no longer loved her, I would take back every bit of my softness and make her understand that my love wasn't a given. If our marriage was to end in divorce, I wouldn't ask for a penny more than what she deserved in terms of marital assets. But she should never have hurt my dad. She had once chosen Luca without hesitation between him and me, so what would she choose between money and Luca now? I was also curious about how much she was truly worth in Luca's eyes. After a brief moment of shock, Becky pointed at me and started cursing. "George! How dare you make such an unreasonable demand? Without me, you're nothing. Are you even a man? You're the most shameless person alive. You want to calculate the marital property with me. And if you want me to sign, you must not take a penny." I ignored her and directly addressed Luca. "Luca, I've already made my offer to withdraw the lawsuit. It's up to you now. If Becky agrees, I'll withdraw the lawsuit immediately, and your mom can be released." Luca hesitated, glancing at Becky, then turned to me. "George, this is between you two. I'm just an outsider. Becky and I are only friends. I'm willing to kneel and apologize. I'll take full responsibility for everything. Please, George. Just forgive me. Don't be mad at Becky anymore. She's only trying to help me. Let my mom go. Please, don't stay angry, I'm begging you." With that, Luca dropped to his knees. I watched him, finding his theatrics almost laughable. Even at this point, he was still putting on an act. Becky immediately pulled Luca up, yelling at me, "George! I must have been blind to marry you. I can't believe you're really this kind of person. You want a divorce now, and you want me to leave with nothing? You can forget it. If you want me to sign, you'll have to leave with nothing yourself." I was stunned by her words. I coldly replied, "Becky, you cheated on me during our marriage, and Tomas isn't even my son. Even if we divorce, you're the one at fault. What gives you the right to demand I leave with nothing? If you really don't want to sign, I'll have my lawyer file for divorce. The result won't change. But I won't drop the lawsuit." Becky was speechless. She furrowed her brow, looking at me as though she didn't recognize me. Luca was growing more anxious, about to speak when suddenly his phone rang. "What? How could this happen?" He paused before hanging up. Then urgently looked at Becky. "My mom got into a fight with someone in the detention center. She's been sent to the hospital. Becky quickly asked, is she okay? Luca snapped, how could she be okay? That place is no place for anyone. Becky, please just agree to the divorce. You're the one at fault, and you'll end up with nothing anyway. Luca, how can you say that? Luca ignored her protests and continued, you cheated on George. Didn't you say he didn't know how to care for you? That you wanted to be with me? If we divorce, we can be together, all three of us, in the open. Becky bit her lip, glancing at me. I leaned back in my chair, indifferent as I returned her gaze. Becky still shook her head in refusal. She ripped up the divorce agreement and stormed out of the office. I returned to the hospital to continue caring for my dad. The next day, I received the signed divorce agreement. She had finally chosen Luca. I smiled faintly and agreed. 20 days later, I held the divorce certificate in my hands, and the heavy weight on my chest finally lifted. Becky, on the other hand, went with Luca to get married. She arrogantly told me, wait for the day you regret and beg me. I turned on my heels and walked away without a second glance. 2 years later, while Janet and I were shopping for our first wedding anniversary gift in the mall, I received a call from Becky. George, how have you been? Janet was busy browsing for a new limited edition bag at the counter, but on the phone, Becky was crying as she said, I really miss you. Everything that happened before, it was my fault. Can you forgive me? George, I love you. I was just deceived by Luca. He said Tomas isn't his. That he wouldn't take care of him. Tomas cries every day, saying he misses his dad. I'm still working to support Luca and his family. I really regret everything. George, let's remarry. I promise I'll be a good wife to you from now on. I didn't know what to say at first, so I handed the phone to Janet. Janet took the phone and said, Becky, George is already married. He can't remarry you. George brought me here to pick out our anniversary gift. And we're too busy to talk. Please don't call again. She hung up and looked at me with a playful smile. Come help me pick which one goes better with autumn and winter outfits. I couldn't help but laugh as she pulled me into the store.